Hello and welcome to the Missing Faces in Teaching YouTube channel. Our focus is research into the publications of Black history in its foundational, truest and evidenced aspects. Today, before I get into the content of today's presentation, I would like to give a special thank you to all those new viewers and listeners who've taken the time to leave such positive comments. You know who you are. I won't embarrass you by saying your name, but thank you. So much appreciated. Now, today is presentation 3, and it's going to deal with Europe, which is one of my central aspects of research in tying up Britain and France and Germany and Spain and showing those cultural continuities. But I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this opening slide because it will set the tone for much of the names and the surnames and the locations. So, for example, if you look above, you will see the crest and the faces for Henry Conquérant or Conquerant or Conqueror, who was the brigadier of the king's armies and governor of the town of Schelestadt or Selestadt, which is located in eastern France and it borders Germany. This is a very key location and we will come back to that. So Conquérant is French, it is Norman. Below, or that way, you see the crest for the family Ufflem, and they're from Westphalia, which is a region in Germany. And we find that name migrates into Britain as Ufford, and it finds itself in Northamptonshire and Suffolk in England. Now, its derivative is found to be Ufa or Ofa, and we find that he was one of the rulers of southern Baratanac of Britain in the early medieval centuries. And so we find that the surnames are migrating through Germany, France, and into Britain. The German Uf would become Of, as in King Ofa, the 7th century ruler of Baratanac. And so it's easy to see through metathesis, which is the transposition of letters within words, and umlaut, which are vowel changes, we can see how those words take their form in different geographical locations. But let's have a look at this slide and trace the French origin of the surname Conquérant or conqueror that becomes conquest. Now, we have kind of been taken off course a little bit because mainstream narrative likes to call him William the Conqueror, when the evidence clearly shows that conqueror, conquérant, conquest is a surname. And if you look over to the map, you can see that William Conqueror was born in Falaise in Normandy, and that in southern France there is another region which is related to the surname called Conquis. I apologize if I'm saying some of these French names incorrectly. But we are able to locate that surname from France as its origin, as it moves through into Baratanac. Now, William the First, or William Conquerant of France and England, has a son, and his son is King Henry I of England. Now, he owned the county of Cotentin in Normandy, which gives us some idea of the immense wealth that this family accrued over time. And so their wealth displayed itself in the stately homes, and that we find the surname Concurrent found in Bedfordshire, where they held a family seat as lords of the manor. The Conquest family owned Conquestbury, which was also another large manor called Houghton Conquest. Now, as you see it there depicted in 1827, the artist has put in later Europeans to suggest that they owned it, but they probably did. But we now know through the evidence that those original black elite landowners, their properties were removed, and the forced expulsions took them away from their wealth, and later Europeans would then come in and own much of their estates and property. Now, it's important that we also look at the map and refer back to this map throughout this presentation, because those regions in France are always going to be influencing what happens in Britain. And so we find the name conquestor as a derivative of conqueror or conquerant. We find Wilhelm Conquestor is the name of a private person mentioned in the HR. Now, the HR are the 100 Rolls, a very important document that I will elaborate on. And Robert Conquerant is found in the same documents, 100 Rolls. Houghton Conquest in County Bedford derives its suffix from the family who were possessors of it before 1298, and so that later painting that you saw on the previous slide of 1827 is just way too late, because it has removed the original owners, the conquistors of that land. We also find that Edward I was the originator or author of the 100 Rolls. Now, as you can see, Edward I was a deeply melanated man, and his father was King Henry III. Now, what does the evidence tell us from the literature? It tells us that King Edward I, here, the man that you see, on his return from Palestine after the death of his father, Henry III, in consultation with his council, decided to investigate improper alienations or encroachments on royal lands and privileges, and also to inquire into the misconduct of local government officials, which have believed to have multiplied during the troubles of the previous reign. For the purposes of the investigation, the country was divided into circuits, and commissioners were appointed on the 11th of October 1274 to travel around each circuit in the counties in Britain to document all of this information, hence the name 100 Rolls, because there were literally hundreds of rolls that had to be collated and recorded and stored. And so this is a legacy of melanated rulers, that they would create this level of record keeping and documentation in which they were recording the surnames. And so we find that Edward I, aka also known as Longshanks, and we know from the last presentation I did that, well, we know that a later European, Patrick McGoohan, played Longshanks, and he looked nothing like the original melanated Edward I, would be given this credit. But we see the father, the son, and the grandfather as a black lineage being retained in history on this particular slide. Now, we know that he was also born in Beaumont Palace, and that Beaumont Palace becomes a very, very important region in Oxfordshire, which we touched upon in the last presentation. Okay, just so that we're clear, Edward I's grandfather, King John, is born in Beaumont Palace, which you see here on this slide, and that Edward I was born in Westminster, which was built by Edward the Confessor. These are all melanated rulers that once we get back into Onomastics, which is the study of history and culture and names, that you start to get back to the original black elites. And so Beaumont, as we found in the last presentation, is the royal house from France of Alexander II from Scotland, his mother, his French mother. She was called Ermengarde de Beaumont. And so that legacy would find itself in Britain, moving through from these French elites, and they would build this magnificent palace of Beaumont Palace. But what has happened to our psychological factor is that the name has been removed and a new name has been put on top. And of course, in the curriculum, the history never goes deep enough. And so what we're left with is that later Europeans such as Winston Churchill would now take ownership of this residence, this royal black lineage, their lands, estates and wealth through warfare, genocide and forced expulsions. And so what does the literature tell us about King Henry II, whose grandfather was Henry I, the son of William the Conqueror? You see? What does it tell us? It tells us that the birth of Henry II had been celebrated by a royal festival in his grandfather, Henry I, new palace in Beaumont Street at Easter in 1133. In this palace, his son Richard I was born. And so the original French lineage or connection, which has been lost to us until now on the pages of this presentation. You can clearly see from King Henry II that their Shakor, which is a Hebrew name for black, swarthy, or the origin of things, and I talk about that in issue 16, you can clearly see that King Henry II is a deeply melanated man from his phenotype. But all of this is hidden from us until now. Just so that we're clear, it's important to know that Churchill is a Norman name that is brought forward from France into Britain. The Churchills were originally the Courcelles, and if you go back to the map on slide 2, you will see precisely where it's located. Courcelles becomes Churchill. Now, just to conclude on that before we move forward, it's interesting to note that the family of Walneus or Wallace in Scotland was a branch of the Courcelles that would become the Churchills, who were the victorious Dukes of Marlborough. That's very important. Now, Concurrent, Henry Concurrent, from the very first slide. was the governor of Sélestat in France. Now, utilizing the methodologies of Onomastics, we find another melanated connection with the region Sélestat, because the city of Sélestat was originally owned by the mother of the Swabian Duke, Frederick I. Frederick I, or Barbarossa, was a German king, a Roman emperor, and the Duke of Swabia. Now, what's really interesting about this particular ruler from Swabia is that if you look, and this has become a bit of a pattern in a lot of my research as well, that the coin is depicting something very, very, very unique to those individuals who were striking the coins. That if you look very carefully at the melanated image, that embedded within the image are actually three faces. And this is a signature, an element of African culture, that those heads or those ori would become the orisha. And I'm finding a lot of this in the evidence, and here is one example. And the work that I'm doing now on Scotland and France and Germany is showing this particular symbolism. But if you look very carefully, you will see aspects of that on the faces. And so Sélestat was originally owned by the mother of the Swabian Duke, Frederick I. And clearly from the material culture and the evidence and the names, we can see that this evidence is very, very strong. As we have seen on each slide through the study of onomastics as history, location, and personal names or surnames, it is now possible to recover and rescue the identities of foundational Black populations. The map that you see is a sample page from issue 16. I also have it in 15 and 17. And it's difficult to capture in this short presentation, but I hope to convey that one of the most monstrous lies that we have been taught as Shakur people is that we have slave names, when the overwhelming evidence is clearly demonstrating that those primordial populations that Diop taught us from all those thousands of years ago would become the founding populations of those elites, those ruling families, those communities that would set up commerce and trade, and that they would grow in their communities with their families and so on, that they originated their own surnames. That this particular map, for example, is showing the density of research that I have uncovered and amassed in my own publications. So, for example, on the opening slide, we looked at conqueror or conqueror, that yes, it occupies all different regions within France, but it also occupies eastern France, which borders Germany. And you can see the influence, for example, next to Westphalia. Now, Westphalian nobility has a strong tradition of Black surnames. For example, Schwartz is found there. And we also find some burial continuities that link up with the material culture of Cornwall. Now, that is kind of taken out of its context from the issue number 16, but you will see how it is all connected. And as I mentioned in the last presentation, this is a jigsaw puzzle that must be put back together. Yes, the work is labor intensive, and therefore your reading has to be as intensive as my role is. And so I would urge you to keep reading and putting the pieces back together again. It's so very, very important that that is done. And so Britain and France, and you can see by extension Poland, in fact the whole of Europe, was melanated in origin, in its function, in its beginning, and its continuation. And so when we dig deep enough, as Dr. Valentine teaches us, the deeper they dig, the blacker the planet becomes. And so I urge you to continue supporting the work of MFIT. We do it with no external funding, and much of the work is ploughed back into the publications which we urge you to purchase and read. And so MFIT will be back with more evidence. Until next time, Ku Amsha, to awaken.